Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Total War Legendary Lord Lore video, and today we are doing Elspeth von Draken, the Graveyard Rose. If you enjoyed this video, ladies and gentlemen, do consider joining or subscribing, or even just dropping a like. Any little bit helps the channel. Got some exclusive content for our members already in the members section, including our ongoing Malice Darkblade series, and we are revisiting the old retro game Shadow of the Horned Rat. But other than that, please sit back and enjoy as we tell the tale of Magistrix Elspeth von Draken, Wizard of the Amethyst Order, the Dark Lady of Nuln, the Graveyard Rose. For 3 generations, the name of Elspeth von Draken, Magistrix of the Amethyst College and Arch-Wizard of the Law of Death, has been spoken of in hushed tones in the reeking tavern gutters and vaulted noble halls of Nuln alike. And for 3 generations, her lonely, blackened tower has stood at the edge of the Gardens of Moor on the outskirts of the great city. And stories of the Graveyard Rose have been used to frighten recalcitrant children home before nightfall, lest the Dark Lady snatch them up. Yet despite these stories, few have ever paused to think what exactly the admitted presence of von Draken in the city actually means, and fewer yet could guess at her true power or influence. Furthermore, the few foolhardy or over-enthusiastic witch hunters, unaware of her relationship to the governing powers of Nuln, or too fanatically sure of their own righteousness to care, who have attempted to delve deeper into her business or storm her tower, have been swallowed up so completely that they have never been able to share anything they have learned. The truth is that Elspeth von Draken is but one in a long bloodline touched by the winds of magic. A bloodline that has produced both monsters and saviors in its time. She is also one of the most powerful amethyst wizards of the age, but one who will have little to do with the daily machinations of power politics of the Imperial Colleges of Magic, in which she was once a student, and still in theory holds fealty, and with whom she now sits in an uneasy truce. Instead, she is an obsessive experimenter and mystic who goes where she will, and she has collected and collated a storehouse of mystical artifacts and lore which she guards jealously, and has become so saturated with the force of Shaiish, the amethyst wind of death, that there are some who whisper she is no longer human at all. A theory perhaps given credence by her almost spectral, pallid aspect, which has remained unchanged for decades. Despite her reclusive nature, dividing her time, it is said, between her tower in Nuln and another like it hidden within the Grey Mountains, or in search of lost lore, she is, however, considered a true scion of the Empire, and the bane of its foes where they cross her path. She also has long-standing pacts and alliances, both with the Church of Moor and with the ruling Council of Nuln, to come to its aid in times of war in return for their alliance. Balthazar Gelt, current patriarch of the Imperial Colleges of Magic, is understandably wary of von Draken's independence and power, and has long had his agents keep track of her where they can. Over the last score of years, they have reported a dozen conflicts, both widely known and hidden, where von Draken has proved the victor against terrible enemies such as the Mire Hulk Rawbones, who had been devouring whole villages along the lower River Sol and demanding bloody tribute in young lives, to the vampire Vishara of Lamia, who had sought to corrupt the noble Jägersbruck family of Thaldorf and turn the city into a shadow realm of undeath. And of course, most famously, the Horde of Tamarkan. For long moons, Elspeth had felt Shaiish, the deadly force that empowered her own arcane art, drawn like iron filings to a lodestone, flowing ever southwards, hungrily, to a growing stain of slaughter being wrought upon the world. Accompanied by a stream of refugees who had come up from the border princes, which had suddenly stopped, prompted the Archmage to investigate with the dread carmine dragon that was her steed. Enslaved to her will by the amethyst magic that flowed like blood through its veins, she had followed the invisible currents of death into the ravaged border princes, and hovered like a carrion crow above the fields of the slain, and stole secrets from the dying souls she had found there. Elspeth von Draken learnt the face of the enemy, and the horror they would visit on Sigmar's empire. Upon returning to the Empire, she went to the court of the Countess Emanuel von Liebowitz of Nuln to warn of the forthcoming horde. A survivor of the slaughter of the border princes had been brought before the court, Leopold the Black, an unscrupulous butcher and dishonorable turncoat, wanted by multiple noble houses of the Empire, but also a commander of some renown, was brought before the Countess, escorted by armed guards to tell of the carnage that had befallen his fiefdom. This testimony, along with the arrival of the Graveyard Rose, was enough to convince the Countess of the oncoming threat, for the mere presence of Elspeth was the surest indication that a cataclysm was at hand. The powerful wizardess usually stood apart from the politics of imperial power, engaging with the city only when some dire peril or deadly rival plagued it. And that von Draken's eerie voice, now added to the chorus of predicted bloodshed, was proof enough for the Countess that Leopold's story held validity. The magistrates, in closed sessions of the Countess's war council, spoke of the restless invisible winds of magic, and how they wax strong and savage. Nuln's preparations for war gathered pace when reports came to the city that the vast Chaos Horde was not to pass through Blackfire Pass as expected, but having already crossed over Winter's Teeth Pass and was massing in the barrens of the Southern Empire. Wiesenland has ever been a sparse, bleak place, its people dour and well used to the privations of raiders and beasts, as well as killing winter cold and the murderous wrath of nature. The abandonment of so much territory to fend for itself in the face of the Horde was a tactic that had been employed before, to fall back and leave nothing to the invader, to weaken and starve the attacker before meeting them in battle at the time and place of the Empire's choosing, was a tried and tested tactic to Wiesenlanders. But against Tamarkan's Horde, it would prove a doomed enterprise. This was no erratic and ill-disciplined orc raid, nor even a half-unseen war of ambush and brutal surprise attack, as might be expected from a marauding bray herd of beastmen. Instead, the sheer size, speed, and ferocity of the Chaos Horde caught the Wiesenlanders off guard, and made a mockery of any attempts to delay or impede their progress. Fortified holdfast fortresses and watchtowers were smashed to rubble with contemptuous ease, their attackers barely pausing to loot the remains, and it was not until the three-pronged tide of destruction closed with frightening swiftness on Faldorf that the sheer scale of the threat was realized with horror. News of Faldorf's near-total destruction came like a thunderbolt to the people of Nuln, and threatened panic in the tide of refugees entering the city, and it was met with a swift and brutal crackdown of law, with the imposition of fines, press service in the militia as favored punishment for troublemakers, or anyone who happened to be standing near them at the time while the order was being imposed. For the forces of Nuln who arrayed for battle, knowing the enemy was no more than a handful of days' march away at best, the destruction of Faldorf and its defenders represented a blow, but also bought them time and precious intelligence about their foe, not least news of their sorcerous might and the strange and terrible siege engines they possessed. And the Countess Emanuel and her council of war, which included Elspeth, drew up their plans accordingly. As the days ticked by like the passage of a clock's hand, the rest of the Horde began to slowly fracture into disparate warbands, pillaging almost aimlessly across the lands to the south of Nuln, while the forces of the Empire were content to rally in the great city and wait for the inevitable attack. Each day bolstered their power, slowly but surely, as just as fractionally the Horde's cohesion and power wasted away. Elspeth observed the Countess Emmanuel, who ruled her fractious city-state from behind her impassive mask of porcelain. The Countess, while no frontline general herself, was nevertheless shrewd of mind and iron of will, as attested to by her long and relatively stable reign over the city-state, as well as the fact she had survived many threats and challenges to her life and power in the past. She had also been known to quote the old proverb of Tilian origin, when her lack of personal martial prowess had been called into question. Wars, the proverb went, are waged by warriors, but won with gold. And gold Nuln and the Countess in particular possessed in abundance. And as the dire import of Tamarkan's threat became apparent, she was wise enough to realize that an empty coffer was infinitely preferable to a slaughtered city. Bearing that philosophy in mind, and with many of their own troops, let alone those of other provinces having been called away, the Countess had to get imaginative to be able to grow their forces. To this end, with proffered payment, open bribery, along with called-on ties of duty, and not a few veiled threats, the Countess's court was quick to impress upon a number of powerful and largely independent factions within the great city-state of Nuln the need to prepare for war, and to do so sooner rather than later. Some, like the warlike Church of Sigmar, needed no convincing to raise its might against the ancient arch-enemy, and soon the preachers and warrior priests could be found on any street corner, screaming and exhortating the masses to holy war, while crazed flagellant bands scoured themselves bloody at their feet, and ruthlessly hunted down and put to death any they suspected of chaos taint. Others, such as the venerable and lauded Imperial Gunnery School, required a little more finesse and purse-filling before they would release the full might of their artillery trains and their own Ironside regiments to Nuln's defense, above and beyond what duty and standing contract required. Alongside these, scores of smaller bargains were struck between Nuln and dozens of mercenary companies, both great and small, as well as notoriously acerbic and independent battle wizards and engineers who made the city their home. And even the half-dozen experimental landships ordered by the city-state of Marienburg and built in the city were pressed into service at exorbitant cost. All the Countess had determined would be needed for Nuln's defense. Even now, as news trickled in of massacres and destructions to the south, naysayers among the nobility and mercantile houses claimed that the Horde, like a dozen greenskin incursions and beastman ravages before it, would spend its strength long before it reached the city. And even if it did, the city was impregnable. These ne'er-do-wells muttered at the expense, poured scorn on the threat, and seditiously whispered of the Countess's ill judgment and weakening mental state. It was not until Theodore Bruckner, the Countess's bulking champion and headsman, mounted a dozen heads belonging to vaunted and important men upon spikes above the gate of the trade quarter, that such talk was, if not silence, then reduced to private whisper. Theodore, the Countess Emmanuel of Nuln's headsman and personal judicial champion, a role that exists to meet the ancient right of trial by combat, available to the Empire's aristocracy except after the commission of the direst crimes, a role he held for over a decade. This makes Bruckner, in effect, both the personification of the bloody-handed justice in the city and death incarnate on the Countess's political enemies. A giant of the man, dour, ruthless, and taciturn. He towers head and shoulders over even the sturdy folk of Wiesenland, who make up the majority of Nuln's citizenry. And it is of little surprise that many tales have grown up to surround him. Some stories attribute his great size to sinister origins in Norska, darkly tainted blood, or even alchemical experimentation at the Countess's behest. The truth, however, lies unknown, save to Bruckner himself, and perhaps his patron. He is famed as a savage, and a skilled, if unsubtle, fighter, and most of all for his prodigious, some say inhuman strength. Such is his physical power, that during a judicial duel with a noted swordsman, Lord Hans Craster, who had, by virtue of superior speed and technique, managed to disarm the hulking Bruckner. Undeterred, the champion of Nuln grappled with his plate-armored opponent, lifted him aloft, and snapped his back with his bare hands. It was to this man, the fiercest and most trusted of the Countess's warriors, that Elspeth entrusted the baleful amulet, a black gem which was said to be able to protect him from the malign powers of the enemy, but in truth possessed powers unguessed at, and served the magistrix's own deadly schemes. Only handed to him by Elspeth, after at the Countess's command, Bruckner had taken an oath, sworn before the great council of the city, to slay Tamarkan for his crimes and desolations against Wiesenland. The day came, and Tamarkan's horde was a shadow of death on the land. The champion on his toad dragon mustered in the center of the horde, surrounded by all sorts of monstrosities and giants clad in plates of armor. To the far left of the horde, a vast contingent of Chaos Knights and Kurgan marauders were being led by a powerful magic user. A third and final threat to the city came slowly but inexorably from the southeast. Between the two Chaos forces, the horizon southwards of Nuln was blackened into twilight, and its voice was the rumble of an oncoming storm. Crossing the river at the Karas's Tower Bridge came a 5-bar column of black iron and hissing steam. The Legion of Asgore, the burning wind shape of Cinderbreath, the Bale Taurus, circling low overhead, with Lord Drazworth gazing down with calculating malice on the scene unfolding below him. The defenders of Nuln had deployed to prepared positions to defend their city in the chill hours of dawn, the fate that had befallen Faldor foremost in their minds. Countess Emmanuel's generals and knights masters had determined to operate a defense in depth, the majority of their forces meeting the horde in the open field where they would be able to maneuver and if needs be fall back through a series of defensive lines, finally ending in the city's fortifications. In this, they hoped to prevent the horde massing its strength, either in numbers, monstrous beasts, or magic, against a single point on the city walls, and shattering through a breach, as they had done in Faldorf. Nor would they allow the strange and devastating war machines that crushed Faldorf to advance within range of the city. The plan called for their destruction at any cost. To this end, nearly a full 1,000 knights, mounted pistoliers, and free riders had drawn up on the rolling downs to the west of the city, while serried ranks of state troops, spearmen, halberdiers, handgunners, and cannon batteries awaited the horde upon the raised banks of the city's flood levees that dominated the peninsula where the mighty rivers of the Ava and the Upper Reich met. It was this boggy expanse that was the Empire's chosen killing ground, and the bulwark on which they had hoped to shatter the horde, in sight of the great city, but no closer. Among the thousands that defended the city of Nuln were more than mere soldiers, for this was a matter of faith as much as survival to some, and for the insane flagellant cults devoted to Sigmar and the zealots of a half-dozen other faiths, martyrdom in the face of the great enemy was a fate to be almost embraced, while at strategic points in the Empire lines, battle wizards from the colleges of magics awaited the ultimate test of their own arcane craft in the fight to come. Many having never before witnessed such portentous turbulence in the unseen winds of magic that whipped and eddied across the skies and sank formless like the fast-rushing rivers through the earth, heralding what was to come. Fate had drawn so many to this hour of deadly conflict, and while Elspeth von Draken watched from the back of her carmine dragon as it clutched to the high cathedral spire like a terrifying, living gargoyle, she could feel the almost heartbeat-like pulse of the talisman she had gifted to Theodore Bruckner, the Countess's champion. Bruckner's role in the battle plan was simple. He was to seek out Tamarkan, the master of the horde, and slay him. An act that alone might make the difference in this day between victory and defeat. Her occult senses attuned to the ebb and flow of life and death, as only an initiate of the Amethyst Order could be, picked out a score of bright, burning souls below her, who might find glory beyond lesser men, or see their spirit candles brutally snuffed out, as merciless chance determined. Not the least of which was Leopold the Black, given command of the Free Riders, whose lust for vengeance was so great she could almost taste it, like bitter blood and copper on her tongue. The day of destruction was born slowly, pale mists clinging to the damp earth, and 1,000 breathless prayers were offered up to the gods of mankind, and screamed in exultation to the lords of ruin. The sun rose up, like a bloody beacon to light the way, and the battle was joined. The Empire's forward battery spoke first, wasting no time. They hurled rapid volleys of cannon fire into the advancing mass of Tamakan's vanguard at extreme range. These long-barreled cannon, lighter than their counterparts at the center of the Empire lines, but still as deadly, and against so great a target, they could scarcely fail to find their mark. Bodies of men and beasts were torn asunder by the steady bombardment, but the horde carried on, without fear or regard, its ranks seeming never to falter, as shot after shot was poured from the soon red-hot cannon. Closer and closer came the horde, and soon the state troops arrayed in the defensive squares could begin to see the true horror of the foe that had come to claim their lives. Horns sounded in the low mists at the extreme west of the Empire's line, where the defenses butted up against the riverbank, but were soon drowned out by the thunder of hooves, as the Kurgan came screaming in a tide of blurred motion and flashing iron. Along the banks of the Upper Reich, the defense centered on Asher's levy, some 400 men and a score of war machines. But it was as nothing against the onslaught of the Kurgan. They came on like a black spearhead, and the Empire's line shivered and shattered at its touch. Redoubts were overwhelmed in moments, horsemen trampling down fleeing artillery crews, and a whirlwind of flashing blades cleaved bloody slaughter through those brave enough to stand before the storm. The glittering armored knights of the Empire countercharged, and were instantly smashed apart, and sent reeling and splintered through a vortex of stabbing spears and flailing axes. And, at the heart of the storm, was their sorcerer, as their sorcerer rained down blasts of bale lightning and malevolent curses from his high throne like a wrathful god. Through the defenses of Asher's levy the Kurgan rode, and none could stand before them. In the center of the Empire's line, removed from the carnage by the river by several leagues, a huge fireball suddenly soared high into the air, before seeming to hang, immobile in the sky like a second sun. Then, at last, it began the inevitable fall to earth. The plunging missile blazed so brightly that the whole army of the Empire was bathed in its angry light. The ranks faltered for a moment, but then the fiery orb struck the ground with a mighty crash, erupting into a ball of all-consuming flame. The whole battlefield felt the impact, and troops from both sides clung to weapons that shook in their hands. Horses bucked, and their riders struggled to hold them. So it was that the Legion of Asgore announced their presence. The fiery invocation had come from the center of a great iron-caged pyre, mounted on the back of an iron-wheeled altar so large it needed to be pulled by 3 iron demon engines. And around it Chaos Dwarves swarmed with uncanny and unnerving position, forming a diamond-shaped deployment at the edge of cannon range from the levy defense lines of the Empire troops, quickly setting up fire positions with their snaking war machine trains, whose clanking and hellish hissing cries could be heard clear to the city walls. Each side aimed to destroy the artillery of the other. The Imperial army possessed many more cannons than the Chaos Dwarves, but at such long range, only the largest guns had enough reach to strike back at the Chaos Dwarves' position. And so, most were forced instead to try and thin the ranks of the Horde as best they could before the inevitable and unholy charge. The death toll on both sides was hideous, and once the skilled gunners of the famous Nuln artillery school found their range, they dropped fire accurately into the Chaos Dwarf positions. One shot carried away an ogre loader who burst apart, showering the Hellsmith artillerymen with the creature's toxic innards. Another cannonball landed into a caisson of mortar bombs and ripped a gash into the earth with an explosive blast which shook the ground for a league around and sent Infernal Guard flying into the air like scattered toys. Chaos Dwarf-made weapons were designed for the slow pace of siege warfare, and their missiles were time-consuming to prime and cumbersome to load. For every shell that hurled towards the opposing ranks, 100 cannonballs spun and bounced towards the Horde. But despite this, they accounted for themselves with lethal force. The firepower of the Chaos Dwarf weapons was suffused with all manner of horrific and demonic force from the great gouts of screaming power that devoured everything it struck, to bolts of molten metal hurled like blazing arrows across the field, and eldritch rockets, which exploded their wrath high in the air to see it race down screaming with diabolical intelligence to hungrily burn the flesh of its victims. Every missile the Chaos Dwarf loosed towards the enemy inflicted intolerable damage. Cannon after cannon disappeared beneath a ball of flame, and soon the front ranks of the Imperial army were in visible disarray, although they held fast, their banners high in defiance. The lines closed. Crossbow bolts shivered through the air. Hideous war cries went up from both sides as the bravery of mortal men held fast to confront an army of inhuman horror and unquenchable bloodlust that hammered towards it. At 200 paces, the Empire handgunners opened fire, a snarling crackle of flame and smoke suddenly shrouding the defenders' lines, and a wave of bodies fell from the Horde into the dirt, cut down as before a reaper's scythe. But the hideous creatures and mutated warriors of Tamarkan came on unchecked, clambering over the bodies of their fallen. Close now, the Horde broke up. The longer gait of the huge bile trolls and multi-limbed chaos spawn running ahead of the pack in their frenzied desire to destroy, while the demon tallymen of Nurgle droned on maddeningly, counting out a litany of the slain, while festering clouds of blood-hungry flies swarmed towards the men of the Empire from the decaying ranks of Nurgle's children, as thick as cloying fog. Meanwhile, high above the battlefield, the Chaos Dragon Rider, Orbal Vipergut, led a force of carrion, vulture-winged demons, tainted harpies, and leather-winged manticore to darken the skies, only to be met in rushing, screaming combat by white-winged griffin-riding knights and a trinity of fire wizards mounted atop a burning wheel of fire and coal-black iron, while all around them the air was rent with shrieking rockets, arcane blasts, and whistling shells. The blood fell like misted rain as they clashed. Now that the Empire's cannons had been largely silent, Tamarkan, led by an honor guard of his rock knights, began to make his charge towards the front line. The ground between the armies was now so loose and pitted that the pace of the heavy Chaos Riders was reduced, but sluggish progress mattered little now. In front of them, the men of the Empire tightened their formation to withstand a charge as the first of the beasts that ran ahead of the Horde ravaged into the lines. Closing ranks to stand shoulder to shoulder, those in front braced their halberds against their right foot and readied their swords grimly to receive the charge. At 100 paces, a hail of arrows and bullets flew from behind the halberdiers, arcing upwards and then down upon the Chaos Knights, but most rattled uselessly against the rusted and slime-coated armor of the Rot Knights, and bounced harmlessly from the heavy plates that protected their mounts. Only here and there did a missile find its mark, piercing the wearer's armor at a joint, or perhaps finding a spot weakened too far by corrosion and canker. A few riders tumbled to the ground, and horses fell screaming, but the horsemen of Pestilence rode relentlessly on. The Chaos Knights leveled their cruelly barbed lances and charged, their hellish gaunt steeds foaming black at the mouth with savage effort. 100 paces distance became 50, 10. Then unexpectedly, the front ranks of the Empire peeled away, revealing a trio of volley guns, multi-barreled iron cannon. It was too late for the Horde to abort their charge, even if they'd wished to, as the hellblast of volley guns erupted in sheets of flame from their spinning muzzles. Each barrel discharged its load of a dozen or more small cannonballs. They cut a swathe through the armored knights and opened great gaps in the Chaos ranks. Those who survived the cannon fire plunged straight into the enemy infantry. In places, the valiant footmen held their ground, but in others they were scattered or cut down. Those Rot Knights mounted upon their monstrous steeds had little difficulty overcoming the fence of gleaming halberd blades raised before them. Chaos-bred mounts crashed down upon the poor infantrymen, crushing the leading ranks and slashing those behind with steel-sharp hooves, as the riders impaled men bodily, one to another, with their lances in screaming slaughter, and lay about themselves with festering, skull-headed flails, which chomped and bit with venom-dripping teeth. But even where the Imperial regiments broke and fled, others quickly took their place, the Arch-Lector of Nuln sending in his pack of bare-backed and bloody flagellants into the fray. But just as the tide appeared to turn, with a deafening bellow, the Toad Dragon and its terrible master entered the fray, with mutated giants and great plague demon things at his heels. Flesh liquefied before the Toad Dragon's foul breath, and scores of men fell screaming as terrible disease and afflictions erupted without warning, kindling like fire in their flesh. As demons of Nurgle drew close, swift-footed beastmen came screaming from behind the tide of monsters, falling with animal savagery on the wounded and isolated in a welter of blood. The battle raged on, and the Empire line began to buckle. Elspeth von Draken had watched all this unfold, but now was the time to act, as her carmine dragon took to the skies. On the southwestern edge of the battle line, where the initial cavalry charge of the Kurgan Knights had been so devastating, they were slow to reorganize, relishing in the slaughter. Taking advantage, the Empire launched its trump card, as floating pontoon forts had made their way down from the city's river gates, their armored decks crammed with mortars and archers bearing the green and black livery of the river wardenry. The explosive shells falling on the Kurgan scattered them as their leaders tried their best to organize them, panicking horses, making the task of reforming for a charge all the more untenable. Enraged marauders that attempted to counterattack were quickly dealt with as they attempted to swim the fast-flowing Reich to reach the enemy. Many were quickly swept away, and even the frightening spectacle of a war mammoth attempting to wade toward the pontoons was cut short, as every short-fused mortar shell, swivel gun, and volley after volley of arrows rained down on the mighty beast, and it soon sank beneath the thrashing black waters. The leaders of the Chaos Cavalry, though, soon managed to regain a modicum of order and prepare the cavalry to charge towards the flank of the center line. A single deployment from the city reserve had managed to form along the banks of Crow's Levy in time to meet the Kurgan charge. The Nuln Ironsiders, the pride of the Imperial Gunnery School, under command of their Castellan, Jubal Falk. As the Kurgan marauders came on, they were met with wave after wave of disciplined gunfire, as Empire snipers took aim and felled warbeasts and the Khans of the cavalry horde, their leaders, causing confusion in the ranks. Alchemist wizards of the College of Metal, long allied to the Ironsiders by ancient bond and contract, wielded their arts to burn and scorch the enemy, igniting their foes' weapons into molten fire in their hands, while hidden mines were detonated in the mud, ripping apart horse and causing one war mammoth to rampage through the Kurgan's own ranks, blinded and driven insane with pain from a fiery blast. Despite the carnage inflicted upon them, bands of Kurgan marauders slammed into the Ironsiders, but their discipline and the heavy armor of Empire troops held them fast against repeated attacks from the horsemen. Although their casualties were great, at the height of the combat, the sorcerer who seemed to be leading this contingent was himself struck down, a burning bullet of mercurial shot smashing into his helm and toppling him. Soon enough, the last of the great war mammoths of the northern waste still fighting fell, crashing into the ground, its hide riddled with hundreds of bullet wounds, a titan laid low by bee stings. Leaderless, the Kurgan assault seemed to begin to waver, when a deafening howl from the heavens drowned out all else in the tumult, as a dark shape crashed to earth from the skies above. The dragon carcass, burning with livid purple flame, came apart like an overripe melon as it hit the ground. The headless broken body of Orbal Vipergut, dragon rider, pinwheeling across the ground nearby. Stunned into paralysis, all looked up as a wide pair of shadow-black wings darkened the sun and cast all in a shadow that bore with it the chill of the grave. Above them, the carmine dragon of Elspeth von Draken lowered its glass-fanged maw and unleashed a blast of arcane power which scored across the Kurgan like a knife blade. Where the blackly burning amethyst light touched, all was sundered into oblivion. Flesh and steel withered like candle wax hurled into a blast furnace, and the ground itself screamed where the blast line touched. The pale scythe in Elspeth's hand flashed, and far below men and beasts died, the life ripped from them, leaving nothing but desiccated husks. The battle wizards of the Golden College could do nothing but turn their masked face away from the display of power and shudder, while the Ironsides that regained their wits redoubled their efforts, pouring fire into the staggering Kurgan, who as one broke and fled. The Battle of Crow's Levy had been won. The Empire flank, against all odds, had held. Elspeth continued on in the battle, her dragon raining down amethyst flame, and her scythe robbing the tainted of their foul life essence. She observed as a huge cavalry flank came round from the northeast to try and take the position of the Chaos Dwarves, aided by the Marienburg landships, enveloping them and causing them to flee the battlefield, before turning and charging into the rear of the center of the horde. Soon enough, the warring forces became hopelessly interpenetrated, and the impetus of the charge was completely lost as the knights and free riders became mired in countless separate hand-to-hand struggles. The savage axes of the Chaos Warriors were turned on the new foe, cutting down rider and horse alike with their inhuman strength. And soon the bloated beasts of Nurgle were pulling knights from their mounts and even picking up horses, riders, all before crushing and rendering them in their tentacled grasps. A great bone-grinder giant, taller than a watchtower, its pale flesh mutilated by masses of weeping sores, strode over a battery palisade, began to pick up a great cannon there, and flung them towards the oncoming Empire cavalry, as easily as a boy might hurl stones at skittles. The carnage the flying metal caused on the onrushing knights was abruptly ended when the giant toppled screaming to the ground, as the wound-crazed griffin, a riderless and bloody saddle trailing behind it, slammed like a cannonball into its chest, and powered away with a whooshing wing beats, taking what was left of the giant's face with it, as red tatters trailed from its gleaming claws. Where there had been the central defense line of the Empire forces, was now a vast, whirling melee miles across. An orderless, leaderless slaughter on a nightmarish scale where no quarter was given, and the screams of the dying hung in the air, echoing as far as the streets of the great city, where refugees huddled in fear at the sound. The ground, already a morass of blood and mud, became a quagmire of gore and twitching bodies. Both sides knew instinctively that whoever won this deadly gauntlet would win the day, and more reinforcements from both sides were fed into this vortex of blood, and the skies above grew black and turbulent, as if the sun refused to look upon the horror visited below. Tamakan, it seemed, left the battlefront, his litany of knights and Chaos Dwarf allies having abandoned him. As twilight fell on the great field of slaughter, the battle finally ebbed away, and the acolytes of the Plague God broke off their assault, leaving only a few insane and uncontrollable monsters to fight on in their stead. Falling back into the gathering gloom behind them, they left the survivors of the Empire armies numb and exhausted, and in no fit state to mount any kind of pursuit, even if they wished it. The death toll had been staggering, and no right accounting could easily be given of the losses Nuln had sustained, but they were without doubt appalling. The fact could be plainly seen and felt by the empty-eyed, stumbling and wounded soldiers that staggered back across the great bridge that spanned the river to the city. Handfuls of men remaining from regiments that had numbered in the hundreds. The citizenry that awaited them, women, children, and old folk for the main, curiously silent, attended to them as best they could, with bandages, food, ale, and blankets. But over the whole city, a pall of foreboding and quiet had fallen, where perhaps there should have been triumph. The skies above grew darker yet, blotting out the moon and stars. All could feel the awful change in the air. A nameless horror was about to be born. It was Elspeth who first sensed the potential danger. In the court of Countess Emmanuel, all was a frenzy of activity, washed over with mounted shock as news of the fallen came in. It was the almost ghostly figure of Elspeth von Draken, who it seemed had paled to a mere shadow, that cut through the court with news of the direst import. Something was happening. On the banks of the Upper Reich, south of the city, something terrible that might yet spell the doom of them all. Tamakan had withdrawn to the Abbey of the Lille, an abbey that had until a few days ago been dedicated to healing goddess Shalia. The assault on the fallen Abbey of the Lille was a desperately arranged affair, and would not have been possible without the combined reserves of arcane power possessed by the near-exhausted battle wizards of Nuln. The conjurations that let them speed and twist distance back upon itself, to allow the war party to strike before it was too late, were so grave that the grey wizard who wove the spell was consumed by it, burning coldly away to a cloud of fine ash in the casting. The ragged column of knights, the blooded survivors of a dozen orders who had endured the battle of the day, launched the attack, spearheaded by the Countess's champion, Theodore Bruckner, riding the savage demigryph, Reaper. The talisman at his neck flaring with amethyst light as it encountered the supernatural miasma that fogged the desecrated abbey. With them came warrior priests and foot soldiers, swordsmen and wizards, all volunteers who knew their survival was far from likely, and above them, the carmine dragon's wings beat the wind-tortured air, and the shadowy form of Elspeth von Draken raised up her glimmering scythe, which crackled with pale fire. The armies of hell rose up to meet them, for the scene they had arrived at was apocalyptic. The air was heavy with the reek of rotting blood and bodily corruption. The wind had become an unending howl of despair. The ground shook in surly protest, Trees swayed in agony beneath the wind's relentless battering, where the waters of the river churned as if trying to flee the bondage of their banks. But nothing, it seemed, could escape the grip of Tamarkan's curse. An oily slick spread over the waters, which congealed and thickened. The skies were racked by peals of thunder and flashes of lurid green lightning. From bank to bank, no water now stirred beneath that maelstrom, for all had curdled to bubbling sludge and slime, the stain spreading across the waters with nightmarish speed. Dark and hideous forms shifted and began to drag themselves up from the slime, and from the shadows of the desecrated abbey, drone-voiced demon tallymen shambled forward to greet the tide of their foul kin erupting in scores from the beyond. The flashes of lightning throwing into sharp relief the teeming multitude of hellishly twisted flesh dragging itself out of the river. The hastily put together company had little time, and charged into the fray. Demon savagery tore at the knights, fetid claws gutted warhorses, dragging them down. But even as they died, the armored warriors slammed their lances into cataract cyclopean eyes, and drove their blessed blades deep into swollen demon flesh. Zealots screamed and flung themselves fearlessly to their deaths. Scourges swung wildly while holy prayers drove them. Hulking plague toads burning them as if the purest vitriol acid had been poured over their flesh. The shifting savage form of a wizard from the Amber College matched claw for claw and fang for fang against the horror, but was quickly smothered and disappeared beneath a mass of rusted blades and scabrous limbs. The sorcerous breath of the Carmine Dragon lashed out, burning a blinding light across the abbey, and smote the chest of a great unclean one, which struggled to free its house-sized bulk from the choked river of decaying flesh and writhing limbs. But it was evidence it would be all for nothing if they could not act quickly, for they were simply too few, and the coming demon legion seemingly without number or limit. Tamarkan was the key, and it was he who must die before the ritual reached its zenith, and a plague the likes of which had never been seen was unleashed upon the Empire. The demigryph Reaper bounded with long talon-sure strides towards Tamarkan, shouldering the plague-bearer tallyman who rose up to bar its path aside, pausing to savagely grab one and shake it to pieces in its razor-sharp beak and fling it aside as a cat might a mouse. Bruckner raised his cold blade above his head and shouted out his challenge undaunted. The enraged Tamarkan, fearless and defiant, was swift to answer, yanking out the great axe from the tainted earth beside the body of his toad dragon and running full pelt towards the demigryph, with a staggering gait, bones rattling wetly within his decaying flesh. Arcane fire burst upon Tamarkan and swathed him in torment, causing him to stagger, and in that moment of distraction, Reaper was on him, its scythe-like talons a blurred frenzy, slashing rotting meat from the diseased bones, its beak shooting forward and plucking the rotting head of the ogre clean from its body. Tamarkan reeled, but it did not fall, and the great axe licked out with a whistling side sweep that caught the demigryph in the breast, stoving in the noble beast's ribcage and cleaving its beating heart in two. Reaper reared up, screaming in death agony, dragging the axe from the Maggot Lord as it did so. Bruckner barely managed to scramble clear in time as the demigryph collapsed dead as a felled tree, and came up swinging, his enchanted blade stabbing and hacking relentlessly at the flailing bulk of the headless Tamarkan. Scoring wound after wound on the tainted flesh, the inhuman horror collapsed to one knee under the onslaught, gushing foulness filled with writhing black worms spilled across Bruckner, and gagging, he staggered backwards, staggered and slipped. It was enough for the maggot to do its work. The obscene creature lurched forth like a striking cobra and fastened itself over Theodore Bruckner's terrified face, crunching through leather and bone and pulsing and writhing within the flesh. Delicate bones splintered like pistol shots as the maggot forced its way down. Here was a proud vessel that would be the last he would ever need. He would not be denied. He was eternal. He was... The talisman around Bruckner's neck burst into furious life, like a burning star unleashed in the night. In a roaring flash, there was nothing but blackened, crumbling bone where the Countess Emmanuel's champion had stood. And in an instant later, even that had been consumed, and Tameken, the Maggot Lord, with it. High above the battle, Elspeth von Draken watched the fire flash and allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. In the instant before, the storm of magic the Maggot Lord had drawn into himself, abruptly cut and folded back on itself catastrophically. Her design had come to fruition. A whipcord of oblivion snapped shut over the spot where Tameken had stood within a hair's breadth of demonhood, and all was laid waste. The banks of the river thundered upward and quaked. The children of Nurgle were scattered and withered to filthy ribbons of ash in the span of a heartbeat. The Abbey of Lille and all within it ceased to be, and in the wide crater that replaced it, a tangled mass of tortured green-black glass pierced the ground like a vile dagger stabbed into the earth. The carmine dragon fell lifeless from the sky, and Elspeth von Draken faded like smoke in the night. And so ended the saga of Tameken, the Maggot Lord, he who sought the throne of chaos, by the ploys of Elspeth von Draken. This was not, however, the end of Elspeth, as after many years she was again seen abroad in the Empire, her pale and youthful aspect restored once more. It is known that she was a bastion against chaos for the Empire, and so the likes of Gelt must do no more than watch. But there are those beneath him in the hierarchy of wizards who fear that Gelt's suspicion of the powerful von Draken may yet provoke a deadly conflict one day between them. And so we end the tale of Elspeth von Draken. Let's take a look at her rules as they were on the tabletop. She was, of course, a level 4 wizard of the Law of Death, the Law of Shaiish, the Amethyst Law. In terms of special rules, she had a rule known as Darkwalker, which meant that von Draken's body had become so suffused with the dread magical power to the extent that she stands halfway between life and death, and at will she can become an all but insubstantial spectre in human form. This makes her immune to psychology, and all to wound rolls made against her have a -1. Unfortunately, she also suffers from any effects that damage demons or the undead. She is, of course, a lawmaster of the Law of Death. She caused terror on her dragon mount. She could fly, of course, and the dragon, the Carmine Dragon, also had scaly skin, as well as a coruscating blast. The Carmine's Dragon Breath weapon is a sorcerous blast of powerful amethyst magic, capable of withering metal and rendering flesh to dust, as if millennia had passed in a mere second. Elspeth also had her scythe, of course, her signature weapon, and the pale scythe was more made of shadow than substance. This weapon, said to be of Elspeth's own making, is attuned to the power of Shaiish, the wind of death, focusing and concentrating it at her will. This weapon gave her killing blow as special. We've encountered that a lot in past characters, and a focus for deathly energies as +1 to any dispelling rolls she might have. She also has her hourglass, Death's timekeeper. This hourglass is an ancient and storied artifact. It is said to contain, as its measuring sand, the dusty remnants of a dead god of old, and von Draken has spent much of her unnaturally long life studying its mysteries. With it, she has performed some limited measure of control over time and death itself. And this meant, effectively, that once per turn, Elspeth could re-roll a dice, basically resetting her face if she missed a wound, or get a defensive dice, or maybe even a dispelling dice that had anything to do with her or her dragon. Basically, the ability to change fate, as it were, with Death's Timekeeper. That's it for Elspeth on the tabletop. If you enjoyed the video, guys, please do drop a like or join and subscribe if you can. It would be hugely appreciated and really help support the channel. But as always, thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright, guys? Bye.